Hi guys, okay, and welcome to the Percussion Revolver series. Okay, this month I'm going to be answering some of your requests where you were talking to me and asking me about the cartridge conversions and where they've taken the cap and ball revolver and converted it to shoot modern cartridges. So we're going to deal with that. First, we're going to deal with why this happened. Well, first of all, the percussion revolvers had come in the 1830s with the Pattersons, and they were not a commercial success. They were very innovative, and they did a job that wasn't possible really before this, of a gun that when you cocked the hammer, everything rotated automatically. When you pulled the trigger, it fired and reset, so you just cocked it again. Really, the Patterson was a prototype. But then the Walker, the Dragoons, the 49 pocket model, the Baby Dragoon, and of course the 51 Navy really solidified it and brought it out. And this idea of a combat handgun that was not just a basically like the old Dragoons of the flintlock era and etc., which was a big bore single shot, get off me, wham, that was quite often loaded with buckshot. It stopped being that of a shock weapon and became more of a more precision weapon where I could direct shots and have firepower as opposed to having just sheer blunt bam at very close range. And that really proved the mettle of it. So by the time of the Civil War, handguns were not just an officer thing. Handguns had become something of a battlefield pickup, had become a cavalry standard. Officers carried them. Common soldiers could pick one up off the battlefield and utilize it. And so it became a very viable gun. But everybody by the middle to the end of the Civil War realized that cartridge firearms were the way to go because of the Henry, the Spencer, and numerous other cavalry carbines of the Black Panther era that were utilizing some form of cartridge that allowed me to reload quickly. You know, paper cartridge or copper cased, whatever. It was something that I could get repeated quick fire much faster, and in a better way than having to stand up and run a ramrod. I could be laying behind a log and break the action open, stick one in and close it and fire, or be something where I worked a lever or something like that. It was obviously the way to go. Well, the war ended, and when the war ended, you had all these surplus guns that were still very viable and were being used with paper cartridge. But these other cartridges were coming available, and because of that, a lot of people wanted them. It was the new thing. It was obviously the future. And so some people, when they had the money, especially still coming out of the California gold fields, still coming out of the Nevada silver, and etc., they could afford such things. So let's take a break here for just a second, and let's talk about the cartridges that came about in that era and how they evolved into our modern cartridges. So let's do that. Okay, now to understand how the cartridge conversion worked, we've got to understand cartridges just a little bit and what was going on. The first, you'd really call it commercially successful round, was actually the 22. It's not the 22 long rifle we know today, but it's the same idea, just slightly shorter. And it was the 22 BB cap, then CB cap, then that led to the long, and then finally the long rifle, and then the 22 Magnum. In the time of the Civil War, they were little small tip-up revolvers made by Smith & Wesson in 22. Okay, so that was one of the first successful cartridge firearms. But by the end of the Civil War, everybody knew, the writing was on the wall, that cartridges are the way to go. So what cartridges were available at the time? Because when they were considering converting these over to cartridge, what cartridges are available? Okay? So they came up with the idea of, for the 36 caliber, let me turn that this way for you. There we go. For the 36 caliber, they came up with the 38 Colt, which initially it was basically the conical bullet set on a brass case. Okay, same one they'd been loading in the gun, but now they made it a little bit smaller where it would fit like a 22 does. There's that shaft, would fit down into a little brass case, and you had that. There was also 38 rim fire. 38 rim fire, just like a 22, because it's very easy to convert the hammers on cabin ball revolvers over to just cut off one side and put a blade up there and have a rim fire hammer. And also on the back, you just cut a little notch into the edge of the chamber so that it would pinch it on hit and therefore detonate it. Now, pinfire guns were done in Europe, so there were some pinfire cartridges created. And for those that are not familiar with pinfire, it looks like a standard cartridge, but there's like a nail sticking out of the bottom sideways. You hit that, instead of hitting the back end of the cartridge, the primer is inside, and you hit that nail straight down, and that would detonate it. So pinfires were also done. In the .44 caliber, the round that was available through the Civil War and that kind of really set the fire to this was the .44 Henry cartridge, which was a .44 rimfire. Around a 200 grain bullet running out of that rifle about 1,200 feet per second. That was the idea of it. So even before the war was over, some gunsmiths had taken like 1860 Armies and converted them to shoot by relining the barrel to .44 Henry. Now, the war is over. We're in that interim year between 65 and 72, 70, 69, whenever that patent's going to run out. That Smith & Wesson had the patent, so what could we get away with? Well, Colt came up with a Thur conversion, which was something that loaded from the front, so they didn't have to load in the back of the cylinder, and use this twisting ring on the back of the gun in order to put the case in and use the rammer to load it, and etc. Overly complicated system. Overly complicated system. But that was the .44 Colt Thur. So that's 44 T-H-U-R. I think it was T-H-U-R-E. T-H-U-R-E Thur system. Wasn't a big thing. Smith & Wesson, remember they're doing that? They had came out with a cartridge that would set the stage for where we're going. And that was the .44 American. Okay? .44 American. That was a centerfire cartridge, which means it could be reloaded easily. And it also was more in what we would think like a modern cartridge, looking at it. Had a little bitty rim on it. Made it for the star extractor of the Smith & Wessons to punch it out. And the first gun that the U.S. Army adopted in 1871, I think it was, might have been 1870, was the Smith & Wesson top break in .44 American. But those guys in the Ordnance Board and in the Army and stuff like that, they remembered the 1860 Army and that .44, which was really a .45. It was a .451 or .454 conical, and they wanted it to perform like that gun we just had. That the .44 American was kind of anemic compared to it, and so they wanted something in that line. So they had asked for, can you make it a .45? And so Smith & Wesson responded by creating the .45 S&W. Ballistic performance, today think of .45 ACP. .45 caliber, 230, 240 grain bullet, moving about 800 feet per second. At the same time as whenever Colt brought out the single action Army, and they introduced the .45 Colt. Colt was absolutely looking to reclaim some of that prestige they had had during the Civil War of the 44 Colt handguns. And so they wanted that kind of power. And so they made this thing to have the full power they could get. Well, 45 Colt, being a 45 caliber 250 grain bullet with 40 grains of black powder shoehorned in behind it, left the barrel of a 7.5 inch barrel, which is this type size barrel, at 1,100 feet per second, 1,000 plus feet per second. The troops thought it kicked too hard, it was too hard to control, it was too much power, really. Well, the 45 S&W cartridge, which had fit the top brake Schofields, worked in the Colt, but the Colt cartridge wouldn't fit in the S&W. The problem was that the Smith & Wessons were great guns, but with black powder they fouled out too quickly. You'd start shooting and it didn't take long before they jammed up because they were too tight a tolerance, and the fouling from the powder just caused all kinds of problems. So could we use that round in the Colt? And so they kind of stabilized on a round that they created called 45 Government. .45 Government. Because of this, the Colt cartridge got a nickname, 45 Long Colt, because it was longer than the Government cartridge. See, and today we still a lot of times will say 45 Long Colt, but it was really just saying 45 Colt, but we hung that modern moniker on it because it was different than the 45 Government. They don't make 45 Government cartridges anymore. I'm sure you could probably get somebody like Starline or something to make the brass. But it was the change that was coming in where the 45 S&W was like this big, and then the 45 Government was just a grunt longer, and then you had the 45 Colt, which was a long caliber. And so that was the cartridges. Now that's in the 45s. Let's step back over here to the 44s just a minute and see where they went. Remember we'd start out with a 44 Henry rimfire. That, we won't even talk about the Thur. That was a dead end. The 44 American, however, the 44 American was liked, and the Russians came in and they liked it. However, the 44 bullet for a 44 American sat on top of the case much like a 22 rimfire does. So there's a shaft that went down into the brass, and that left the bullet with exposed lubrication rings. Well, they picked up dirt and grime and everything else. It came off on your hands, and it fouled up in the bore and etc. And the Russians didn't like that. Could you make it go all the way in the case, much like we do with modern ammunition? So they redesigned it, and that became the 44 Russian, which was a 200 and something, usually around 200 grain bullet, moving at the same speed as the 44 Henry. Okay, and so that became the 44 Russian. Really good cartridge, and that cartridge became the darling later on of the target ranges because it was so consistent. It didn't have that much recoil, but it had pretty good hit, and yet it was controllable, and therefore was easy, and they could dial it in for target work. And many of the Smith & Wessons and Colts and other manufacturers were manufactured in 44 Russian, and it was considered like a target round as well as being a defensive round for militaries and stuff like that. It was very accurate. Now, from that cartridge, from the 44 Russian, which is duplicating 44 Henry, okay, rimfire, duplicating it, but it's in a centerfire straight wall case. The Winchesters had been in 44 Henry, and that was the Henry rifle of the Civil War, the improved Henry, commonly called the Model 66. And they wanted to up that power. Remember, we're in the early 1870s, and so the American had come out, and so had the Russian. And so combining it with the bottleneck cartridges that were popular in what was called express rifles of the day, they created a cartridge for Winchester called 44 Winchester. Today we call it 4440. .44 Winchester centerfire. And that cartridge was the deer cartridge of choice up until the 30-30 took away that mount. It was Colt in 1878 would chamber it into their single action armies, and it earned the nickname, and in fact to be marked on the barrel, of Frontier 6-shooter. It allowed you to have a rifle and a handgun in the same ammunition. And it was very, very popular, very effective, and worked very well. But remember that old tapered case, that stepped case? Worked great in rifles, but in handguns, sometimes it'd be a little bit hard reloading because the shoulder wouldn't be right and it would be a little iffy in trying to put it into place. So somebody got to saying, you know, how about if we take that 44 Russian and we bring the power up so it's equal to the 4440, okay? And so they just lengthen the case up. But something that was new at the time was smokeless powder. And so to distinguish it from the others, and they were going to load it with this powder, they called it 44 Special. What was special about it? Smokeless powder. 44 Special. Then Elmer Keith got a hold of it in the early 1900s. He jacked that power on up a little bit. He'd started out in the 45. But there's a problem with the 45 that I'll get to in just a minute in going up to modern. And so he backed up and went to the 44 Special, and he started doing hotter loads and things like that because there were reasons he felt it was better than a handgun. Because the 44 Special in a handgun did what the 4440 did. Okay? But it didn't have that case design. It was a straight wall case. And so it was doing the same thing. Well, he bumped the power level up until he got it where it was about maximum for what he wanted. And that is, of course, the 44 Magnum. Now, in a 44 Magnum today, you can shoot 44 Special and 44 Russian. And I believe 44 American, because they're all the same thing, just longer case. It's the same other basic things, other than the fact that the 44 Russian and 44 Special, when they were started out, had the same 200 grain bullet moving at about the same speed. The same speed as the 44 Winchester out of a handgun. Okay? The 44 Magnum is duplicating what the 4440 does out of a rifle. So what's the speed of a 44 Magnum? The same speed as the 4440 out of a rifle. It's just a heavier bullet. See, so they're kind of staying in the same ballpark, but each one goes, oh, I'd like to have it. Can I make this do that? And that's what they're trading off. They're paralleling off of each other as they go. So the 44 Magnum is where we got that. Now, remember I talked about there was a problem with the 45. The 45 had started out being that 45 S&W. It had become the 45 government. The 45 Colt was right here. And the reason Keith had gone to it and walked away from it was the brass. Plus, when you look between the cylinders, the walls between the chambers, it's very thin on a 45. And Keith, as he was hot loading it up, it got to where there was a problem with the guns to blow up. Keith had a couple of guns blow up. In fact, that's what got him started into reloading in 1900 on New Year's Eve. Him and some guys were celebrating, and at midnight, they were sitting on their horses and they were shooting their guns straight up in the air. And he had taken a bullet that was really meant for a 50-90 Sharps and loaded into a 45 Colt. At this time, he was heavily into 45 Colts. And it was way too much for that old black powder gun, that old black powder single action army, and the pressure was too much, and just tore the top strap off of it. And so he had a little bit of a worry here with 45s, that how thin that meat was between the chambers. If you went too hot, you could crack it. And in the metallurgy of his day, he wasn't too far off. So he went to the 44 because it was thicker meat. The chambers were thicker between, and so therefore were stronger in his mind. Plus the brass was a little stronger in his mind. Okay. Now let's come up to modern time. Okay, so the 45 Colt kind of got stuck. Why didn't the 45 Colt end up in lever actions? It didn't have any rim on it. It was purely for a government. And modern guns have to be a grunt bigger, because if you tried to take a modern 45 Colt and put it into an 1873 single action, the rim is so big you can't put two rims side and side. It becomes a 3-shooter. Because the rims are actually interfering, because the original rim on the cartridge was a lot smaller than it is today. Today it's got a big enough rim like the 44 Magnum where you can put it in a rifle. You got something for it to grab and extract with. But the original was just you barely hook a fingernail on it. You know, remember the rod punched it out in the middle. It didn't have to grab nothing. And Smith & Wesson's had that star extractor, so they was just enough for it to hook it, and that was it. Okay. So the 45 Colt in modern times, and especially in the 1960s, kind of got rediscovered. One, because of cowboy shooting and stuff like that in all the movies, and people like Skeeter Skelton and stuff like that was looking at them cartridges, and they liked to load the 45 Colt and stuff like that. And then a guy by the name of Bill Ruger came on the scene, and he had a modern design with modern steel that could handle 44 Magnum pressure. So you could get the Ruger Black Hawk and Super Black Hawk in 44 Magnum. You get it in 45 Colt as well, and you could load that 45 Colt up. And so reloading books and stuff would have big bold letters, Black Hawk only, on those loads, because they were afraid that you had great granddaddy's old single action from 1873 that had been passed down the family, and you're going to stick one of these barn burners in it. It wasn't proof for that. It wasn't even close to that kind of power level back then. And so it would be too dangerous. And so many manufacturers were scared. In fact, the manufacturers over the years for the 44 Magnum, for the 45 Colt, have kind of scaled it back a little bit. Even the 4440. Because they're afraid you've got an old antique and they're scared you're going to bust it. So the load you go buy at the store today is rather a weak load, to be honest. So the 45 the 45 Colt, the guys got looking at it in those Rugers and things, and they changed it just a little bit, and they called it by a different name. They changed the brass just a little bit, so you couldn't put it into a Colt, but you could shoot a Colt in it. And that became 454 Casull, which was it's like the 44 Magnum power level in a 45. And then here just a decade or so ago, they decided to push it a little bit further, and instead of just making the brass a little bit longer, because they'd got about as long as they wanted to be, they made it a little bigger in diameter, and that is the 460 S&W, I think, which is actually a 45 scaled up a little bit. So, to recap here, I know this is long-winded, but I wanted you to understand where it went. At the time of the end of the war, when they had these cap and ball revolvers, and which way we're going, where are we going with this? The 38 Colt, 38 rimfire, which would eventually lead to, you guessed it, 38 Special, and that would be hotted up to 357 mag, and that would be hotted up to 357 max. It's the same cartridges, we're just adding more horsepower through time. because we got better powders, better brass, better guns. Kind of go a little further with it. But in 1865, if you were talking 44, it's probably going to be a 44 Henry was the most commonly available cartridge. It's rimfire, and you could easily reline the barrel and convert an 1860 or even a 58 Remington over to 44 Henry, a rimfire, and a lot of them were made into that. If add just a little bit of time, and you've got the 36 calibers where you're going to convert them to 38 Colt or 38 rimfire. How about 1870? Well, 1870, then you've got the 44 American and the 45 S&W floating around. So that's what they had to convert to. See, these cartridges laid the foundation for our modern day cartridges of the 357, the 460, the 44 Magnum. This is where they started. And you've got a perfectly good functional 51 Navy. This may be a gun that you've carried through the war or you picked up surplus fairly cheaply, and you'd like it in cartridge. Well, a gunsmith could convert it fairly easily to 38 rimfire, and the cartridges were available, and the power level was about that of a, combat load of 18, 19 grains and a conical bullet, like you'd fought the war with, so the power level was there. Would make sense, wouldn't it? Same thing with the 44s. I could convert it over to 44 Henry and have a lever action rifle if I had such money. Those things were not cheap in those days. And have a handgun to go with it. This would, later on, whenever you saw the guns made into 4440 popped up, the cartridge for the 4440 is too long to put into the 1816, etc. But those 44 rimfires and things, or the 44 American, would use the same bullet. So it's different brass, but same bullet. So my bullet mold would work. You see what I'm saying? These guys were trying to utilize the same components as much as possible. It was only later when we started getting where everything was specialized. In those days, it was, this is a 44 caliber bullet, what can I load it in? And so that's where that got from. Okay, now that we've done a little history of cartridges and you understand what the cartridges were and where they were coming from, now let's go back and let's talk about the 1871 a little bit more. Okay, so now we talked about how these cartridges came from the percussion era and came into the modern day. And that's where we get today's 44 Magnum, 45, all of the above. That's where they really started, was back in that day and came up to now. At the end of the Civil War, Colt had produced 100,000 or whatever, 200,000, a big amount of these 1860 Armies, the 51 Navies, and a small degree of the 61s. And they were surplus available for it. And so you want to convert this over to a cartridge firearm. The most common way that they would do it would be to take the back of the cylinder and simply put it in a lathe and turn it down. Now they could then make a donut and swage it on there and just bore it through and have one long cylinder, and that was those 44 rimfires and other rimfires where they would reline the barrel, because we think, oh, that'd be a waste. Maybe not. Maybe you bought a surplus gun at a military outpost that it's surplus because it's got a damaged bore. It went too long without cleaning and the bore is just rusty and pitted as all get out. You can't hit nothing with it. Well, they would reline it, turn it into a 38, or turn it into a 44 Henry, or something like that. That was a very brisk business by many of the gunsmiths of the day. So the 1860 right here was sort of the watermark that the Army was going for in power, accuracy, etc. But Roland White and Smith & Wesson still had that patent, and therefore they owned the right for the bored through cylinder. Now some gunsmiths just converting one Smith & Wesson didn't get all out of joint over that because it was one of, you know, and it was one here, one there. Maybe this guy converted 40, 50, 100 in a year. Now, if you were doing 1,000 at a time, Smith & Wesson would be knocking on your door. But these 2 here, 3 here, often it wasn't worth their time to go through the legal proceeding of coming and demanding you stop production, take you to court, and etc. when you're making 40 guns a year. You know, maybe 2 or 3 a month. Not worth their time. The big things was. But Colt had this assembly line for the 1860 Army. And so he went through his engineers and people like that and said, what can we do to turn one of these into a cartridge firearm so we can be ready when that patent expires? It's just a year or two. And so the first thing they came up with was that Thur conversion I talked about. Not very successful. And then they started working with the idea of utilizing as many of these parts as they could. Now, you're going to see a controversy with this, because you're going to have people that talk about how, no, these were made from scratch. It's an 1860 Army blank. That means that when they created this barrel blank, that is now going to go through the machining process to make the cutouts for this loading rod to go in, to the rifling of the bore, etc. And to cut this out for the conical bullet to be loaded. They start with the same blank. They just don't do all them operations to it. It's the same cylinder, blank, that they're just going to turn into a cartridge. It is the same action and everything verbatim. And so with that, they were able to make, and the first was the Richards conversion, which had a ring back here on the back and a firing pin back there. That was in 1870. Then in 1871, they had the Richards Mason conversion, which kind of simplified it and used a little bit more of what they had laying around. Didn't have to manufacture quite as many pieces. And that was the Richards Mason. We commonly call that a 71. And that's what this is an 1871. Now when you look at it, side and side, with the 1860 Army, you can see exactly where they got the lines. Everything's in the same place. It's just they didn't go through the milling process up here on the front to create where this loading lever went. But it's the same action and everything. It's just back here on the back, they've got this ring that allows them to turn it into a cartridge firearm. Straight through cylinder with a loading gate. And then on the hammer, they simply, as you can see there, it's simply a pin put into the face of a hammer blank. Whereas on the percussion gun, there's that slot there for the cap to split on and for the safety pin to sit over. Therefore, they're just utilizing what they got available. Front sights are very similar. They bored through right here and put an ejector housing on it so that they could open the door, rotate that up, and punch out your empties of the various cartridges we talked about. Now this came out in 1871. The very next year, up here on the barrel, you've got a little bitty rear sight, and that's called the 1872 open top. Okay? And then that led to this, which is the single action Army. And you can see a lot of lineage right there between design cues and etc. of where they got the basic idea to design the single action Army. This would become military issue again, and Colt utilized a lot of it. But it's a top strap solid frame, but you can see where they were going with it. Same grip, same basic internals, same feel, same hammer throw. All of it, they just improved it a little bit. Let's flash forward to modern times. Back in the 1990s, I'm sure it was done before. There's a gentleman named Green, I believe his name was, that he was out of Oregon. And he was a gunsmith, and he started to do cartridge conversions where you could take an 1860 Army and he would convert it over to 44 Colt. Okay. Now, what he was doing was he would reline the barrel like they had done to make the original guns, and then he would have a cylinder that was usually made from scratch and or had the ring on the back of it, and would have a loading gate and be very much like the Richard Mason. Okay. But he made it in 44 Colt because that was a caliber that didn't exist. It was actually very, very close to the 44 American, which Colt had done that at the same back in the historic day as well. And by doing that, he had something you couldn't pick up factory ammunition and drop in there and damage the gun. It's still a black powder gun. You still have to load black powder ammunition for it, right? Those guns were very expensive and a rarity, and when they started hitting all the gun magazines and people were doing reviews of them, I wanted one desperately. It was only a few years later that Uberti brought out the 72 open top to kind of do that. You know, same job, but now you can get it in factory. And they made their first ones in 44 Colt as well. I had one in 44 Colt, which was just a shortened down 44 special case to be about the size of 44 American. And you had to hand load for it. Well, now with cowboy action, we've kind of come full circle now, and now the manufacturers have invested more into the design and etc. So you got factory ammunition that you can go buy off the shelf and put into them. So the difference between my 1860 Shiloh and my 71 Richard Mason and 45 Colt, there's several subtle little differences that you don't really notice when you first look at it until you really invest a little bit of time and see the difference. For one, the cylinder of the gun is actually a little bit bigger than a standard 1860 Army because, remember I talked about them rims? They've got to make space for the 45 Colt rims to go all the way around and have a full 6, otherwise it's a 5-shooter or 4-shooter. And so they have actually enlarged the cylinder just a grunt to make it fit properly. So the whole action has been scaled up just a grunt to make it fit properly. So I go and I buy one of the cartridge conversions, or you've already got an 1860 or a 51 Navy or 75 Remington, and you want to drop in one of the cartridge conversions or etc. The question that I'm being asked is, can I and what can I use for ammunition? Okay, like I pointed out in my little cartridge history just a minute ago, these guns are not a terribly strong action because they do not have the top strap of the single action Army. Okay, so within their power band, they're perfectly adequate. So if you got one of these cartridge conversions in 45 Colt, all of the 45 Colt factory ammo that isn't rated plus P, you can buy and drop into it and fire. The cylinders are modern ordnance steel and they're heat treated just like a modern 357 or anything else. So the cylinder will handle it, but the barrels are still a cap and ball type barrel, and you can't just shoot anything in it. Now I just said I can take anything off the shelf and put in it. Yes, but here's the important piece of information you need to realize. The rifling inside of a cap and ball revolver is set up for lead bullets, not jacketed bullets. Jacketed bullets are much harder and are very, tough to push down a barrel. So you do not want to shoot a jacketed hollow point 45 Colt through one of these reproductions because you're going to wear out your rifling very, very quickly. Now, in the past, I had a friend of mine who got an 1860 Army, and he had been a master machinist in the Navy. And so he worked on a sub-tender, and so they can basically remanufacture your ship at sea if you'd like. So he had no problem taking that cylinder, chucking it up in the lathe, cutting off the back, making a ring, and making a cartridge conversion for his, and converting his over to 45 auto rim. I know you've never heard of that, but it was a cartridge that came up during World War I, and it's a 45 ACP, but it's got a rim on it. So it's not meant to go in an automatic. It's the same cartridge, but it's meant to go into a revolver. Okay? So he had plenty of room for that there. The problem with it was then he wanted to shoot the jacketed ammo. He basically wanted to use it like a 45 ACP. And since that jacketed ammo was cheap and available, his idea was he would just take 45 ACP jacketed hardball, load it to about 800 feet per second, and everything should be fine. He didn't get 500 rounds through the gun until the groups had just grown till it was like a trash can lid. It was 18, 20-inch groups at 25 yards. Why? The jacketed bullet is wearing out the rifling very, very quickly. It's so hard, and the rifling pattern and design in the cartridge conversions is still designed for lead bullets, and it's just not going to take it, and it just wore it out. Initially, man, actually was fantastic for that first 100 rounds or so, as that rifling is biting into that hard jacket. But which is harder, the jacket or the lead, or the jacketed bullet or the barrel? Well, the barrel's harder, but not by much. And so it's kind of dulling the rifling every time it shoots. And so like 500 rounds, it was a ridiculous pattern on it. And he's frustrated trying to figure out, and then he bought a brand new barrel and wore it out in 400 or 500 rounds shooting jacketed ammo. When he shifted over to lead bullets that were cast to go into a 45 ACP, he had no problems because of the rifling. Okay, so you've got one of the drop-in cartridge conversions. Any factory lead, that was the important part, lead bullet that you can pick up, mostly cowboy action, stuff like that, will fire just fine. For those of you that reload, staying in the reloading of the lead bullets will be the way to go with it. And what I recommend you doing is asking around to friends that's got it. Somebody's got some molds where you can get some tests. And then when you find whatever bullet design it likes, buy the mold, probably from Lee, and make your own bullets. That's what I've done. Mine is in 45 Colt, and I hand load for it. And I've got a 250 grain lead round nose flat point. That is the ammunition I shoot in it. Now, how much? How fast, Blackie? Okay. Do not consider anything that says it's for a 4.54 Casull, for a Ruger Blackhawk, or etc. That's loaded way too hot. These are designed for around 800, 850 feet per second. Keep it under 900 feet per second. That's the standard load. It does more than well enough. You can hunt with this, you can defend with this, etc. That is more than hot enough. And that's like a standard 45 Colt load. There's no reason to climb on up in power, and the design can handle it. And this is true of the Remingtons as well, because that's not, the cylinder will hold it. It's proof of that. But the action and the design of the gun is not. So you still need to limit yourself to cowboy type loads. Somewhere around lead bullets, somewhere around 800 to 850 feet per second is where you want to stay. Okay? That's the kind of loads to do. Talking about the 36 conversions, stay in the standard 38 special power range with lead bullets. Okay? And you'll be fine. Don't use 38 special plus P. Because when you say plus P, you're actually in the bottom end of 357. and it's a little too hot, and the rifling is not set up for that. And when you accelerate, let's say to 1,000 feet per second or beyond, you start letting the bore, and lead gets deposited in the bore, and then you got to scrub it out. Your accuracy goes away because now your rifling is getting coated, because the lead bullet, due to the heat and friction of it going down the barrel, is actually kind of melting a little bit, sanding it a little bit in the barrel, and so your accuracy goes away. So again, stay under 1,000 feet per second. Somewhere around the 850, 900 feet per second is where you want to stay in any of them. Okay? That's all the 38s, and that's all of the 45s. Stay somewhere in there. All of them, lead bullets, etc. I don't care what somebody in some gun test showed you shooting jacketed hollow points. I bet you that was a loaner gun, and I bet you he ain't worried if the rifling's wore out in 100 rounds. I want accuracy and to be able to hunt with these and use them as field guns for the long term, and I don't want to wear them out prematurely by subjecting them to that kind of wear. So, I'm going to shoot mine right quick for you to show how it will work in that, but standard 45 Colt. Now, I have even seen some of the cylinder conversions in something like 4440. That, if you got a 4440 rifle, okay. But I would recommend against it. I'd recommend you get 44 Special instead, because it's a straight wall case, and the 4440 is that tapered case. It's a bottleneck case. And the shoulder of it can be a little iffy in your reloading, and it can be difficult to chamber it. My single action Army right here is in 4440, and my number one consternation in loading it is every time I load, I have to hand check every round to make sure it's going to just drop in, because it will drop in, go that last little and then stop, because the shoulder ain't quite at the right angle for that final seal up. Okay, where the straight wall cases just normally slide right in. So 44 Special would be a better choice than the 4440, unless you already got a rifle. Okay. Hand loading, like I said, go with the Lee Precision loading information, because all of their stuff is already reduced down to a safe level. If you started with a maximum load that they list, you're still in the safe area. Okay. Look at the powders, look at etc. Educate yourself, and I recommend to anybody that's getting into reloading and doesn't have a background in it, buy or find a copy, a used copy of the Lee Precision Reloading Manual. Read the front of the book. It's written in common everyday language. It explains like I explained to you, in depth, so you can understand how to reload and what each of these steps do and why we do these steps, so that whenever you sit down to actually start reloading, you have a working knowledge and therefore a safety margin to understand what you're doing, and you're not going to make a mistake that could cause you problems. Okay? Follow that book. That'd be a good way to do it. Now, let's load this thing up and let's show you what it'll do. Okay, I got my eyes on, got my ears in, I'm loaded up with 5 of the reloads. Let's see how well I can do it 10 yards with an old blind man shaking and etc. Don't laugh. Not too bad. Not too bad for 10 yards offhand. Half blind old coot. Can't see. With a little slit for a back sight and a thin little blade. That ain't too bad. I only pulled one off. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shots right there. Not too bad. The cartridge conversions can be very accurate guns, but you have to understand, one, what was the mindset of why they were doing the conversion? Two, what was the limitations of the design and what could they put into it? Three, modern conversions, what are their limitations? What bullet should I use? What power level should I use? That's the thing. So, to reiterate, any lead bullet off the shelf that is of the sufficient size to drop into your gun. So it's a 38 special, 44 special, 45 Colt, etc. 2, lead bullets only. 3, don't use anything that's listed as plus P. 4, if you're going to hand load, and I recommend that everybody does, stick with lead bullets and look at the Lee Precision book, because it would be a good education beginning for you. And keep all of your velocities somewhere between 800 to 850 feet per second. Should be more enough. You saw how she barked and shot. And I've chronographed mine and they're 852 feet per second. So that's more than enough thump for a 45 Colt for close range hunting, carrying and shooting. You don't need a Magnum. The only time you need a Magnum is when something weighs 2 tons and it's going to chew you up if you don't stop it. But for standard plinking, target shooting, etc., I have loaded these 45 Colts down to as low as 500 feet per second for a pure target load. And when I bring somebody out that is not used to handguns and they want to shoot this big gun, I will load it with those special low velocity hand loads, and it's just like pop. There's hardly any kick to it at all. They can become accustomed to it, so when we go up in power to the actual field load that I use, they're accustomed to it. Hope this helps, guys. I hope it gives you some ideas. Please leave any questions or comments below, and I will be happy to get back with you as fast as I can. Till next time, guys, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.